Hello, my name is Amy Zhang, and I'm here to talk to you about building governance in online communities and our tool called PolicyKit, which helps communities with doing that. And first, a little bit about me. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Washington, where I lead the Social Futures Lab. And we're really at this intersection of computer science, design, social science, which you'll get a sense of in this talk. And please visit our website to learn more. All right, so I'm going to get into the talk for today. So I'd like you to consider the tools you use for participating in online communities today. Things like Slack, GitHub, Discord, Reddit, mailing lists, etc. Now I want you to think about how governance happens in these online communities. You're probably intimately familiar with this because you are maintainers of many online communities, but this is the common pattern. So there's this kind of strikingly similar style of governance when it comes to all these different platforms. And the structure is that there's admins who have a lot of power, there's mods who have some powers, and there's regular users who typically don't have any governance privileges. And these tools, what they describe is a permissions model where you have something called a permissions table. So when a user wants to do something, the tool can just check what permissions they have in this permissions table. And if the user has permissions to do that thing, then that action is approved. And then certain sets of permissions typically get bundled together into these roles, such as admins and mods, as I mentioned earlier. So while a typical mod can carry out certain actions, such as moderating content or removing users, you really need an admin in order to have the permission to actually change the governance itself, such as switching out who are the mods. Meanwhile, once again, regular users don't have any say in the governance of their community. And this roles and permissions model is prevalent in lots of different software out there, not just community ones, but also collaborative ones, such as file sharing platforms, collaborative document editing platforms, even down to the access control for files in Unix-like operating systems, which is where this pattern kind of first emerged embedded in software. And this roles and permissions model in collaborative software is so ubiquitous that we kind of take for granted how actually opinionated it is and how it encodes a particular set of values. And it turns out that a permissions model can only describe a limited range of governance out there. It's kind of top-down, it's autocratic. So if I'm an admin or mod, what I say goes. And it's also typically punitive. So power lies in giving or taking away permissions from others. And when it comes to governance and looking around at our offline communities, our offline governments, there's actually a lot of other styles of governance out there. And maybe some of these other styles actually better embody the values that you might have as a community. So, if as a community you wanted a different style of governance, say something that's a little more democratic, you only have a couple of options on pretty much all of these platforms. You can either carry it out manually in this kind of ad hoc way. So, maybe you're a Reddit subreddit that wants to have elections for moderators and term limits. So you could just manually go and collect votes on the platform, or use a separate platform for doing votes. But then you would go and manually change out who are the mods, or the admin would do that. You could use or build one-off software for automating some of these things. So maybe you create a bot that can add simple polling to a platform. But overall, doing either of these two things is cumbersome and it's very error-prone, particularly for the manual approach. And then building bots to make things a little bit easier can help, but these one-off bots can also be really hard to maintain. And at the end of the day, because the underlying software these communities are using has already embedded this roles and permissions kind of top-down autocratic way of doing things, trying to do something else actually takes effort to kind of work around that. However, what if we didn't start from this roles and permissions defaults and then try to graft on top of that? What would it mean for software to not actually encode this pattern with all of its embedded values, but actually let communities be able to build for themselves the types of governance that they would want that better suits their needs and values? So that's what we were trying to do with PolicyKit. PolicyKit is this kind of programmatic structure for empowering online communities to concisely author a much wider range of governance procedures out there, and then actually be able to automatically carry out those procedures on their home platform. And the way that PolicyKit does that is, instead of having this permissions table and this permissions way of thinking about things, we instead turn towards articulating procedures, where a procedure can express a much wider range of governance models, such as participatory and democratic ones. And so the way that works is, instead of looking up a user's permission via a permissions table anytime we want to do something, now we look up and we run policies in PolicyKit. And these policies are these short procedural scripts. In a PolicyKit, they're written in Python that govern this particular action. And if that policy passes, then that action can be approved. So that's how that works. And then when it comes to actually modifying the governance itself, we also have policies for that. So say a user would like to do an action which involves changing the policies that are already out there. Well, we have policies written for that. Again, these scripts written in Python. For instance, to change a policy, first there should be a 2/3 majority vote to approve that policy change. If that policy, which is kind of this continually running thing that's checking these actions, if it passes, then that policy can go ahead and be changed. So we call policies that govern everyday actions on a community platform, platform policies. And we also separately have constitution policies, or policies that cover actions that modify the governance itself. And this is taking inspiration from political science theory developed by Elinor Ostrom, who is a Nobel laureate. And I wanted to explain a little bit how these policies actually look. And here's an example of a policy that creates a random jury of members to vote on renaming Slack channels. And the structure of writing a policy involves implementing these 6 functions, these 6 kind of chunks of code. And just a caveat here that the exact syntax that I'm showing you, it's evolving because we're kind of actively working on developing our API. So please check our docs for more up-to-date examples. Okay, but at a high level, it's the same. So there are these 6 chunks. The first chunk is the filter step. And here we're just trying to say, for this particular policy, what actions does it govern? In this case, it would be Slack channel renames. We have a second function that's about just any sort of code you would need to have to initialize the policy for this action. So in this case, we want to actually go and grab 3 random community members to vote on this rename. Next, we have notify. So this is so that people don't have to go to the PolicyKit website or something. We can actually go and tell people on the platform that something has been started for this particular action. In this case, that a jury has been selected, and then we notify the members of those juries that they've been added to this jury. Next is kind of the most important part of the policy, typically the longest part of the policy, which is check. And here we check whether an action can pass or not. So in this case, this Slack channel rename can happen if the jury has voted by 2 or more jury members. If they have voted no, or if some period of time has elapsed, then this action will actually fail. And then we have small chunks written for what happens when something passes and what happens when something fails. In this case, the channel actually gets renamed or nothing happens. Okay, so that's how you write a policy. But these executable policies aren't that useful unless they're actually running on something. We felt it doesn't really make sense to just build our own community software since there's tons of them out there, as I mentioned earlier. Many of them are quite good. People don't really want to move from platform to platform. So the second part of PolicyKit, beyond being able to author these policies in a flexible way using code, is actually having that governance then run on a community's platform of choice. And I'll explain how PolicyKit does this, and this kind of explains why we break down a policy into six functions. Okay, so we have 2 kind of services here. We have the platform that the community is on, and we have a PolicyKit server sitting somewhere. So things are happening on this platform, say it's Slack, say a user is trying to rename a channel on Slack. What happens is we have on the PolicyKit server something called a platform integration, where we've written bindings to that platform's API, where we're able to listen to things that are supposed to be governed. So in this case, we have a listener that's listening to channel renames that are happening on Slack via Slack's API, and then we're catching those actions as they're happening, and then we're running it through what we call our policy engine. So this is where those policies that we have written are kind of continually checking actions that are happening. In this case, say there's that jury policy for channel renames, and we're now executing those code blocks that we had written in the policy. And those code blocks lead to certain things happening. So for instance, if I've checked the policy and it turns out that we don't actually know yet whether it can happen because there's got to be this vote that happens, what we do is then we instantly revert that rename action on Slack. So basically, at a higher level, think about this as like the platform has that permissions model on that platform, right? So there are specific permissions that are possible and not possible on Slack itself. And in order for PolicyKit, which has a different model of governance that a community has created via these policies, to actually be able to govern things that are happening on Slack, we have to listen for those things that are happening on Slack and quickly revert them if it turns out the governance says that they can't happen. And so in this case, we don't know yet whether it can happen. So we go ahead and revert it instantly. So the change hasn't gone through on Slack. Then we do everything that we need to do, such as notifying the jury. The jury members are voting, and that actually happens on Slack. So we've designed it such that you don't actually have to carry out governance on our server, but you can do everything from within your platform of choice. So maybe the jury's deliberating, they're voting, we're listening and catching those votes. Meanwhile, this policy engine is still looping. And at some point, this check function either passes or fails. Say it passes. Then we take our platform integration and we go ahead and rename that channel on Slack. Okay, and in addition to this policy engine that's listening and checking for things, we also have a website, the PolicyKit website, where you can kind of see the status of governance on a particular community. So you can log in with your platform account and see what other users are there, see what roles there are, if there are roles of any kind, and all the actions that have happened, all the policies that are in effect in this community. And there's also on the website, we've built policy code editors for people that want to review or edit or propose new policies for that community. And as you can see there, the policies themselves are written in Python, and we've added various things to the online code editor to support editing code in Python. Okay, so I wanted to give some provocations for your community, whether or not you use something like PolicyKit. I think these are questions that are important for you to take away. So one is, what are the values of your community, and how does the design of the governance that is enacted in your community a reflection of that? Sometimes we found that community might espouse particular values, but the governance is some holdover from just kind of whenever they started the community. And it's kind of stayed that same way until the current moment. And perhaps it's time to kind of reevaluate whether the governance makes sense at that point. And we found that this is actually a really tricky question. And when communities are faced with this question, there's often a lot of discussion, deliberation that needs to happen, as well as reflection. And then second question, so how does the community software that you actually use encode certain values? And how does it structure community collaboration and discourse to make certain things easier and other things harder? Another thing that we've found from our discussion with communities is that not only do you take for granted a particular governance design, that governance design often arises from using a particular software that encodes a particular governance design by default. And those defaults are a lot easier to use, and it becomes a lot more work to have a different style of governance. And it requires a lot more intentionality to come up with a different style of governance. So think about whether you're kind of taking on some of these defaults without deeper consideration. And then a final question, which if you'd be interested in talking with us about it, we're really interested in your thoughts on this, is if you could, how might you change your governance, and how could software scaffolds help make it easier? So we really think that in this online environment, the architecture of the software kind of really pushes you in one direction or another, and perhaps a different software architecture could actually help support different models of governance that are more democratic or more participatory. Okay, so just a quick update on sort of what's going on with PolicyKit right now. We have platform integrations built at varying levels of completion on a bunch of platforms: Slack, Reddit, Discord, Lumio, Open Collective, GitHub, Discourse, several more. We're now collaborating with the MetaGov project, where this is a group that's building the MetaGov gateway, a unified API for governance, and we're using their API to add additional platform integrations. So definitely talk to us if that's something you might be interested in helping out with, adding a new platform integration to your platform of choice. We're also working on improving the policy engine, so supporting specifically non-programmatic ways of creating policies by building policy templates and creating kind of a hub for people to share and remix the policies that they create. And then finally, we're also working on updating the website. We're trying to improve this user experience for folks who want to author policies, pilot or debug the policies they've created, and also kind of audit and monitor those policies and governance transitions over time. Okay, so you can learn more about PolicyKit at policykit.org. If you want to be one of our alpha testers, please let us know. We have a bunch of different groups using it at the moment. You can see our code on GitHub, and I will also want to thank the following folks who have contributed tremendously to PolicyKit. And my contact information is at the bottom. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.